Chris Hedges, the broadcaster, writer, analyst, and host of the Chris Hedges Report. It's always a privilege, Chris, to have you on the mother of all talk shows. Before we turn to the Tucker Carlson affair with the Reverend Munter, let's talk about the breaking news first. Joe Biden appears to be considering dropping the charges against your friend and mine, Julian Assange. What's your take on that?
Biden has so many difficulties now in the upcoming presidential election with eroding support. I'm certain he doesn't need or want to add the persecution of Julian Assange to it. Remember, we have had, as in Great Britain, we have had not only constant protests over the genocide in Gaza, but I think what has spooked the Democratic Party and the Biden administration is that these protests have not abated, not only in terms of frequency, but in terms of size. So they definitely don't want to add to it. So yes, there's been talk of a plea deal, some kind of a pleading out on a misdemeanor to possessing classified information. That's been in the works now for several weeks. So we have known that there has been interest on the part of the Biden administration in perhaps not extraditing Julian Assange, which is very, very good news if that happens, because, as you know, once Julian Assange is in the clutches of the U.S. prison system and the Eastern District Court of Virginia, it's a pretty bleak outlook for him ever getting out.
Well, it's a very tight timetable they're now working to because the British High Court required an answer assurances on 3 points at its last hearing, and the United States must give those very soon indeed. It can't be much more than 10 days away from now. They have to satisfy the British court on several points, but the most important one, it seemed to me, was that they would have to give an assurance that Julian would be afforded First Amendment rights in any subsequent proceedings in the United States. And it struck me immediately on reading that condition that would be a difficult one for the United States to concede. So perhaps it's in their interest now to negotiate some kind of dropping of the main charges rather than have to refuse the British High Court the assurances that they're seeking.
Well, it's interesting. I sat through the trial. I was in the courtroom, and we knew that there would be, it's almost certain that the two panel of judges would allow an appeal because under repeated questioning, the prosecutors refused to offer assurances that, one, Julian would not be subject to the death penalty, and two, that he would receive First Amendment protection. Now, maybe that was done intentionally. Gordon Kromberg, the chief prosecutor in the Eastern District Court of New York, has made public statements that Julian will not receive First Amendment protection. So all they have to do is not offer those assurances, and Julian will most likely not be extradited or certainly will be allowed to appeal.
Yes, it would be better if Joe Biden is right in this consideration. He then drops the charges, then Julian can go free. If he's merely allowed further to appeal, he continues in this incredibly unjust persecution in Belmarsh jail.
Right. Well, my guess is that this plea deal, which has been quietly in the works, is probably the exit. It's not a matter of dropping. Well, it's a matter of dropping the most serious charges and having him plea out to a minor charge. I suspect that's the exit, if there is one.
Let me turn then, I don't know if you were able to hear us. I know you're on the move. We just were talking about the extraordinary Tucker Carlson interview, which has been seen by 12 million people in less than 24 hours, in which it seems to have come forgive the pun, something of a revelation to many of Carson's audience that there are Christians in Palestine, surprise, surprise, and that they are treated every bit as horrifically as the Muslims in occupied Palestine are. Has that taken you by surprise, the furor over this interview?
I mean, it's an indication of how illiterate most of the public is vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. Remember, we had a church attacked and destroyed by the Israeli army in Gaza, with Christians who were taking shelter in it killed. No, I mean, it's on so many issues dealing with the apartheid state of Israel and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I have to blame the media for this. The public has just been very, very ill informed. And this is just one example of how the media has failed to do its job. So I wasn't surprised because of the paucity of decent coverage, with the exception of alternative media or Al Jazeera. My old employer, the New York Times, remember, they ran an editorial denouncing calls for a ceasefire. And then, of course, the whole specious story about systematic sexual abuse, which turned out not to have any victims. So I think it's an example of how ill-informed the public is, and how the media, the mainstream media, legacy media, has failed to do its job.
Of interest perhaps only to those of us in the same business, how do you account for Tucker Carlson's trajectory towards being the man that raises this kind of thing? It's quite a surprise, knowing what we do about Tucker, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Tucker Carlson, and of course that's why he's not on Fox anymore, is actually willing to grapple with issues that challenge the mainstream narrative, this being a good example. And I think that you do it all the time, I do it all the time, but he has a kind of a megaphone or a perch because he came out of that legacy or establishment commercial media that we don't have. But he's used it. I mean, he's used it in this case in a very positive way. But that's why he's no longer there.
Now, I said earlier in my monologue that having been temporarily shaken by the murder of the 7 foreign aid workers, 3 of them British, 1 of them an American Canadian, 1 Irish, I think, 1 German, having been temporarily shaken, where Western ministers, your president, were beginning to indicate that this was a red line, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, that measures would have to be taken, curbing arms sales and the rest. They seem to have recovered, these Western leaders, recovered their bottle, as we say in Glasgow, and now they're doubling down again. There's going to be no ban on arms sales from Britain. Netanyahu's not going to be told by Rishi Sunak that Britain considers Israel to be committing war crimes, both of which were briefed to the media by the British government. Austin today, Blinken today, insisting that they have seen no evidence that Israel's committing the crime of genocide. Am I right in saying they've recovered their confidence and doubling down?
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's farcical, these briefings about how Israel has not violated any international laws or the Leahy Act, any of the acts that prohibit indiscriminate use of U.S. weapons that are supplied to a foreign country. Because, of course, if they admit it once, then the pipeline has to be turned off and it has to be investigated. So they're not going to do that. I think the outrage comes from the fact that World Central Kitchen was a Trojan horse. It was set up with the embrace of Israel and the United States to replace UNRWA. It can't, of course. It doesn't have the capacity, logistical capacity to replace. This is the UN agency that supplies aid to Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, both within Gaza, the West Bank, and the diaspora. I mean, probably well over a couple million. I don't know the exact number. And so they had set up this entity as a way to justify the severing of funds to UNRWA and create a situation by which UNRWA would be destroyed. The central, the kitchen, the global central kitchen doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the trucks, doesn't have the drivers, doesn't have the infrastructure. In fact, Israel was going to handle the distribution. So I think the outrage was over that they were working with the Israelis essentially in this subterfuge, and then the Israelis killed all 7 aid workers in these trucks. I mean, one truck after the other. They were piling from one damaged vehicle to the next. They were all gunned down by drones, probably operated by 19-year-old kids in some base outside of Tel Aviv. So I think that was where the outrage came, but it was never going to translate into a severing of arms shipments.
Now, I'm sure you've caught the news that Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas chair of the Politburo of Hamas, 3 of his sons and 3 of his grandchildren were murdered today in what can only be a carefully targeted strike. Can't have been an accident. They were driving in a small car, making Eid family visits, and they were all murdered in a puff of smoke. And I was asking the question in my monologue, is there anyone in Washington, London, or in Tel Aviv who imagines that this crime, on top of all the other crimes, can possibly contribute to anything good? What do you say?
Well, this is the typical modus operandi of the Israeli army and has been for decades. They not only target Hamas leaders, resistance leaders, but they target their families. I knew Abdul Aziz Rantisi, pediatrician, one of the founders of Hamas. He was assassinated with his son. His wife was killed, probably in a targeted assassination at the beginning of this genocide. I knew his successor. Both he and Sheikh Yassin were both killed, and then Nizar Ryan took over. They obliterated his family house with all of his children. I've been in the house with all of his children and his wife and everyone inside. So that's how they operate. There are no rules of engagement. If you are in any way, well, I mean, at this point, anyone in Gaza is a target. This is a war against Palestinians. But in this case, I think you're probably right. They were clearly targeted. That is the way they operate. That is the way they have always operated. It is an absolutely appalling strategy because we're talking, of course, about children. It doesn't matter who their parents or grandparents are, but that's how Israel works. I mean, when they go after a suspected Hamas militant in an apartment block, they'll take down the whole block. They can kill 100, 200 people up to get one target, and that's how the IDF works. This is just normal.
Yes, but at this moment in time, we're told negotiations are at a critical stage in Cairo between the very same Hamas, albeit acting through a third party, either Qatar or Egypt or both. Is this an attempt to wreck these negotiations? In which case, does Israel really want its hostages to be returned? Are there people in Israel who don't want to see their hostages returned?
Well, first of all, I suspect a fairly large number of those hostages at this point are no longer alive, number one. Number two, if the Netanyahu government wanted the hostages returned, he could have done it on October 8th. All they had to do was create a ceasefire. Those hostages were taken in exchange for the thousands of Palestinian hostages, which include women and children, of course, there could have been a direct exchange. The Netanyahu government never wanted to do it. I think the families of the hostages in Israel have figured out that their hostages are being sacrificed. I see no good faith in these negotiations between Israel and Hamas. But you're right. I mean, this will make that intractability more intractable, but I think it was pretty intractable to begin with.
So what happens next, Chris, in your view? You're long in the tooth in this area. You know the terrain, you know the political forces at work. Is this going to continue for another 6 months, for another 6 years at this level of intensity, or what?
I think the intent is quite clear. I know the intent. I don't know the outcome. The intent is to create a humanitarian crisis of such catastrophic proportions that the Palestinians in Gaza have two choices: die or leave. They can die from smart bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, so-called dumb bombs. They can die from snipers. They can die from starvation. They can die from infectious disease. Remember, there's no clean water. But those are the options that Israel intends to lay out, and we're talking in a matter of weeks. Israel hopes that that humanitarian crisis, which of course they have engineered. Let's never forget that there are thousands of aid trucks, literally just a few kilometers from Rafah, that the Israelis are not allowing into Gaza to alleviate this crisis. And they hope that that will put pressure on governments like the Sisi government in Egypt to expel or deport these Palestinians. I mean, the pier itself, remember early on, the Israeli press was reporting that there were feelers out to countries in Africa, Latin America, where in exchange for remuneration, would they take Palestinian refugees? And how would those refugees be delivered? Well, they'd walk off a pier onto a boat. So that option is also open. That's clearly the intent. I think as long as the United States, and I see no sign that they will, continues, if they won't halt arms shipments, and I see no sign that they will, as long as those arms shipments continue, I think about 68% of munitions Israel is using now comes from the United States stockpiles, then that intent becomes, we come closer and closer to seeing that intent realized. But that is, there's no question now as to what Israel is doing and what it wants. The only question is whether the international community will continue to be as supine as it is to allow Israel to carry out this genocide.
Lastly, and I'm grateful for your time, Chris, on what I know is a busy day for you, is Iran ever going to respond to the attack on their embassy in Damascus? Should we be looking out? Are we expecting to wake up one morning and discover some severe retaliation, which will then presumably beget a further strike from Israel and more retaliation? Are we helter-skeltering into what's always described as the wider regional war?
Well, Israel's pushing it. I think if we had to nominate a country that has practiced the most restraint at this point, it would probably be Iran or Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah does not want to see West Beirut flattened as it was in 1982 by the Israelis. There has to be some kind of a response. My guess is they'll calibrate that response in such a way as not to create a regional conflagration, which I think neither Hezbollah or Iran wants. But I think in many ways, Bibi Netanyahu may want. And so he may keep prodding Iran, poking Iran, baiting Iran in such a way that they're forced to respond with more overwhelming kinds of attacks and firepower. And then, of course, we're in really serious trouble. Then we begin to talk about the real possibility of a regional war.
Chris Hedges, as always, a pleasure to listen to your wisdom and experience. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows.